My name is Grace DeWitt, and I'm the National and International Outreach Programs Coordinator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. I'm so happy to welcome you to this fifth virtual artist panel in our series of 6 about the exhibition New Worlds Women to Watch 2024. New Worlds features 28 contemporary artists from across the US and around the world, and the show opens at our museum in Washington, D.C. next month. I have the pleasure of working with the museum's network of 31 outreach committees, and these committees are groups of NMWA members who advance our mission for gender equity in the arts far beyond the walls of our museum in Washington, D.C., through grassroots programming and audience building in their respective regions. Women to Watch is an exhibition series designed by NMWA in collaboration with its national and international committees, and my colleague Irene Zara will go over the series in greater detail. Irene is Associate Curator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and she, along with Senior Curator Jenny Trainer, is one of the co-curators of New Worlds Women to Watch 2024. It's a privilege to hear from Irene and the incredible artists in this show. As we move through today's conversation, please ask your questions at any point using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll send little reminders about that as we go through. We'll have some time to address your questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic on to Irene to get us started. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Grace, and thank you to our artists for joining us today in this roundtable on technologies, and to everyone for tuning into this, what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful discussion. So what Grace mentioned about Women to Watch, it is a collaboration with our various advocacy groups, our outreach committees, nationally and internationally. And every 2 to 3 years, we come together, the committees and the museum, along with regional curators, to come up with an exhibition called the Women to Watch exhibition. It's a theme that Ginny and I pick here. Every iteration of it has a different theme. And so this theme is called New Worlds. And the theme for New Worlds really came up in 2020 when we were opening the last Women to Watch exhibition called Paper Roots. Those were artists working in paper. And it was in the midst of the pandemic, and there were a lot of different things happening in the world, cries for social justice, a lot of discussion about environmental loss and climate change, women's rights, a lot of things. So Ginny and I really wanted to address those themes in the show, in the next iteration of Women to Watch, but not just through the eyes of the present moment. So the question that we asked was, if artists were to envision a different world, whether that's a different past, a different present, or a different future, what might that look like? And so when we sent that prompt out, we got many different kinds of ideas. And I always stress that Women to Watch is not a competition, and each of these regions sent various nominees, and they all had incredible ideas. And the way we pick these artists, these 28 artists, is that they all tell these stories. They were like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. They come together to tell stories that have synergy between their ideas, or they take different points of view from a particular issue. And so we're really excited to see this show open in just a few weeks. We've just begun installation. And so, yeah, I hope everyone is able to come and visit the show. So what happened when we got the submissions, and as we were finalizing our artists to be featured in the exhibition, is that we saw there were certain sub-themes that came up. And one of these sub-themes is this idea of technologies, which is what today's roundtable will be based on. And so technologies is a top of mind theme. I think there's a lot of talk about that these days. There's a lot of polarity and ambivalence in general about technology in society today. It's obviously something that advances us. If you think about medical and scientific breakthroughs or ways to connect people from different parts of the world more efficiently, more quickly. And yet there's also a lot of anxieties about, machine takeover, in a sense, a more automated society run by artificial intelligence. Those are also ideas that are kind of on the national platform and international platform today. So the three artists in this panel all make use of technology in their art practices in innovative and surprising ways. So we're going to hear a little bit from each of them about their practices and about the work that's in the show. And then hopefully everyone sends some questions in and we can get into a little bit of a conversation with one another. So let's start with Marianna Dixon Williams. Dixon represents Georgia and is and as I'm doing that, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Preview. Okay. So Dixon represents Georgia and is an interdisciplinary artist and a professor of new media at Mount Holyoke College. Dixon builds handmade electronic objects and creates installations that question themes of identity, environmental change, and the ability of our present world to be simulated and measured digitally. Their installation in New Worlds, called Hanging Valley, builds off of previous work that explored the continuously changing environment of the Arctic Circle. So with that very brief bio, Dixon, why don't you tell us a little bit more about this work?
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Irene. Over the past 8 years, my research, it has been used to question how we perceive the natural world, sort of how we measure that digitally, but it's all based in this understanding of climate. And in a way, when I think about how this work began, I think about growing up in Georgia, thinking about how I was connected to the land, and that the land was not just this object that we can control, but how it's intimately tied to my knowledge of droughts in my hometown growing up, or growing up around a coastal city as well, where the ocean's coming up to the steps of our house, and thinking about how these coastlines are changing. Even thinking about, if you've ever spent some time in the South, about the steaming heat of summer, and how my mom and grandmother still claim that that's why they don't have the same amount of wrinkles as they should, despite my childhood. So, I think a lot about when I'm making work, I think about the way that in our culture, and also around technology, we're, given the space where we're expected to be provided with all of the answers around, we're providing answers. I provide answers as a professor to my students. I also run searches or use data to try to gather information about the natural world. But I think that the best conversations that we can generate about the environment are through presenting these spaces within galleries or within, art contexts that are asking questions more so, that are inviting presence through listening. My idea of activating a space would be to go out into environments like the Arctic Circle or like my home state of Georgia, to try to navigate and find information by building handmade devices that will allow me to record sound or data from the environment, maybe take video from the environment. When I was first starting out, I would take meteorological kites and build cameras that would attach to them and fly them above the environment to try to find all of the spaces that a camera might be able to go, or all the spaces that some kind of old technology or new technology could go, that would allow me to experience the world in a way that was different from just vision. So by focusing on senses other than vision, maybe through sound or touch, or the way that we're navigating over time through space, I was able to bring that back into galleries through these sculptural interventions or objects, and have someone who's in the gallery activate the piece and experience that information for themselves. So the work for the National Museum of Women in the Arts is based on a project I started in 2013. These are some flexible audio discs, and they're taken from recordings of glaciers from the hull of our ship as we're sailing through the Barents Sea, from Norway past Russian like all the way up into the Arctic Circle. And I was thinking, well, how do we measure and document an environment that's so rapidly changing because of our actions, perhaps, or for other trends in climate? There's still so many questions about it. And I was like, well, I can create an index of this space. Maybe if I created a layered recording of what that environment might look like. And then the record of that space, the discs themselves, when you play them, over time, they actually erode as well. So in a way, it's like the recollection of that space is also changing, and our perception of that space as we listen back to the record of it is shifting in a way that the environment itself is also shifting. You know, when I came home to Georgia after that, I got really involved in the open source software movement and building electronic devices that would allow me to map out and navigate through radio waves and intercepting the different electromagnetic frequencies in the grid of my hometown. And I wanted to figure out like how I could reorient to a place that I'd grown up in. You know, in the one hand, having grown up there, mostly thinking about the environment, but also thinking about, you know, I'm a little queer kid in the South. How do I navigate the social spaces? And, you know, how does the environment reflect that social condition as well? So, you know, I think there are always this sort of expansion that's occurring in the streaming of media. When we think also about the work for the National Museum, I'm building these structures. I guess, Irene, should we move to the next? Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, so for Atlanta Contemporary, which was the first iteration of the New Worlds exhibit, sort of taking these elements from the natural world and rebuilding them. So taking video, projecting it back into the space, taking sounds, activating that, thinking about the navigation and journeys that we're taking through the environment. And I think there's something about the work for DC where I'm taking these features primarily in terms of the Hanging Valley, which is the negative space, or when glaciers melt, this sort of chasm that they leave on the side of a cliff. And thinking about these other structures like glacial erratics, which are the solitary boulders that get stuck in a valley after something's melted. And then using those to frame the media pieces and the data that was collected and the videos that were taken from the Arctic. So kind of collapsing the two times together. So, you know, I think a bit about building, I think about what are the expectations of, you know, the technologies of even these construction practices, you know, yeah, basically building a space that allows us to enter and participate together in that conversation. So, thanks.
Thanks so much, Dixon. So just to kind of help me sort of clarify the work and the purpose of the work in my mind. So was this project, as it sort of originated, an investigation into how you would recreate and share your experience of exploring the Arctic Ocean as you went on the boat, or was it more about technology and new media presenting information to us that humans wouldn't be able to perceive with their senses alone, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, that's a great question. I think it's always a little bit of both, because we're always kind of telling our stories as much as we'd like. I'm the reference point collecting the information. So there's a little bit of I first began working with technology because of my own, honestly, I get quite lost in space. And so there's a little bit of personal motivation for wanting to figure out the world and how we're kind of navigating. But the primary focus of the work is really thinking about how different technology allows us to see things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. So visualizing data lets us see stuff that we know is there. Like, let's say, you know that there's wind, but you can't see it. So how do we describe that? And then, you know, by looking at, it's almost like looking at the backside of something. Maybe that will, in a way, ease biases around a conversation or create points of connection. If we're just starting with our senses, then maybe we can find some common ground on these major issues around climate.
How has the work, you've addressed this a little bit, how has the work evolved from what you started out with in 2015 to what you will now be showing at NMWA? The concept is still there, it's still the same, to show these aspects of the Arctic Circle that's rapidly changing that we may not be able to perceive on our own, but we do with the help of this technology. But how has it sort of evolved? Are there new considerations, new elements?
Yeah, there is, when I started the work, I was just leaving actually a painting program. And I think a lot of my work was coming out of critical theory and painting and sort of thinking about, I had this crisis of like, oh my gosh, I can't just make work that's going to be sellable, or, this is really important, And so I think in 2015, 2013, I was really focusing on what are ways that I can, all the different ways I can use technology and new media. What are things that I can invent? What are, these documents that are indexes of these places in the world? And a lot of that lived as media objects and these things that were always contained within a screen. And over time, I felt like there's so much of my experience in that space. And if you've ever spent time in a really open, expansive space, it's a really physical presence in a way that I felt related to some of the architecture and sculpture and other, I guess, growing up, I was also a cyclist and an athlete. I raced at a professional level for a long time, and I missed that bodily presence in the work. And I felt that a lot of it felt like it was reading a book. And if you were just looking at it, I felt so academic. And so I felt that if I could, as I started to go deeper into the project, and I started to think about like, if I can build a context for this that's also an index of, and maybe a metaphor or an analogy for, what are our construction practices? How is the natural world growing and evolving? And it created a second layer in a way to the work. So I would say that the biggest thing has been trying to think about, I needed to build a space for people to actually sit in that wasn't just in their heads.
So when people walk into this brand new installation at NMWA, what are they going to be confronted with? What are they going to be seeing? Is it going to be largely an audio piece? Are there going to be visual elements to it?
Yeah, so there'll be some large sculptural elements that you'll be able to walk through the center of that actually represent the Hanging Valley structure. There's a sort of rover pod that holds the discs themselves that you'll be able to see, and then you'll be able to actually activate and play there's a self-playing record player that you hit a button and it will play for you the sound, turn itself back off, as well as a video of there's a few connected microcontrollers that generate video notes and data from the environment, or more like video sketches of the Arctic navigating, and work from there's a documented settlement from north of everything you can watch.
Yeah, it's funny because I was there at this the opening of this exhibition, and you were, I think, doing carpentry even on that day. Like, you love to build,
Right.
with your hands. You really work with the technology, and you will be building this or installing this work and building it really on site in a couple of weeks before the show opens, which is so exciting. I'm so excited to be witness to that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. It's building is something that I think growing up I was always expected to be this Southern lady, but I'm queer and non-binary, and my family are builders, and so I always think there's something a little bit funny about this like construction. Like, I'm always hauling really heavy things around.
Yeah, so you talked about how the idea of environment impacts social spaces, and I think when it comes to the built environment and urban spaces, and like man-made constructed spaces in relation to identity, I can definitely see that connection. But you work so much with natural spaces. So what's the sort of correlation in your mind between like natural spaces, landscapes, and let's say queer identity or social identity?
Yeah, I mean, in a simple way, when I was growing up, I was so afraid to come out because of the social culture that I grew up in, that I was like, well, everyone likes the environment. I could talk about that. And it's one of those things. I think my environmental work became so much about loss because there was this duality that was happening in my own life. And I felt that all of this work of navigation and loss and what would happen if this or that became this metaphor for my own identity. And in a way, as I've grown up, I think we grow up into ourselves a bit. And as I've grown into my own identity, I actually found that this work can, as a metaphor, in the same way that technology eases the way that we're able to talk about difficult issues around climate, the structure of a metaphor or an analogy like this navigating the environment might be like navigating the space of coming out, or of what are the rights that we have as people? How do we talk about non-discrimination? Regardless of sexuality or gender or ethnicity, class, I think that can be a way to open up conversations that I wouldn't otherwise be able to have. And to, in a way, water was a big, thinking about water and focusing my environmental work on natural effects of water, and thinking about water as something that changes shape based on the container that it's within, but it has a constant identity. And I loved that there's so many flexible metaphors and analogies in the natural world that gave voice to some of the nuanced or more difficult conversations that we were having that I was having in my own life at the time.
That's really, and then the parallels, and I think also to show, that the environmental loss, that climate change, all of these things affects us in our lives in so many ways that you may not be able to perceive right away. Environmental loss is, I think, a nice way to transition, as sad as it is, to Irene Fenara's work, because I think there are definitely elements of that in this next piece that we're going to be talking about. Irene represents one of our international committees. She's representing Italy in New Worlds. And for Irene, the act of looking is central to her research and practice, and producing a deeper reflection on images. The work in New Worlds that you see here on the screen is a large-scale tapestry called 3000 Tigers, in which she uses an algorithm to generate a new digital fauna as a reflection between the natural and the artificial. So welcome, Irene, and just wonderful to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this work is from a series of tapestries I did thinking about how images of tigers are more and more than real living animals. And I was thinking about this proportion, about number, because in the year I made this work, that was 2020, real living tigers were more or less 3,000. Now, fortunately, this number are currently growing, and I think there should be more than 4,000 tigers right now in the world. So it's a good thing. But yeah, I was really impressed about these numbers, and this idea of something that there are more images of something than the real object is actually something that you can apply to every object. But I was interested in the figure, in the image of the tiger, because it's very, very present in our collective imagery, but at the same time the animal was disappearing. So that's why I decided to work on this kind of image. And I choose to work on these numbers using a generative algorithm, because at the beginning I was interested in the idea, in the conceptual idea of the generative algorithm, because I was thinking a lot about words like to generate, to reproduce, to save, and so on, because are words that works well both for the natural world and also for the image making. So in the technology of the image making. So that's why I choose this kind of technology, and I really like to choose technology based on the idea and on the project, because I think that every device and every technology can bring a very precise meaning, then can add meaning to the work. So that's why I choose a generative algorithm. And what I did was to create a data set that is a folder that the generative algorithm needs to reproduce something without copying it. So I created this data set with 3,000 images of a tiger, so the number of the living ones. And at that time, in 2020, the algorithm wasn't able to reproduce the image of the tiger only using 3,000 images. So maybe today is easier, but in that year was also something meaningful to me, because the algorithm gives me these abstract images that has just some colors of the animal, but not, I don't know how to say, a very similar image of a tiger. So it's like a visualization of the animal that is disappearing in a way. And yeah, and I started also this project because I was thinking a lot about how technologies can change our perception of the world, and in this case of the nature. So the image of the tiger is very pervasive everywhere. Everybody knows how a tiger is, but yeah, the animal was disappearing. And I choose to make the final form of these images using tapestries, because I was thinking about, you know, skins of animals that are used in certain home, like carpets. So I was thinking about skins and yeah, the skin of the animal. And at the same time, working with tapestries made me think that the way tapestry is working is very, very similar to the way the generative algorithm works. Because you can see all these ropes in the texture of the tapestries that are very similar to pixels in the construction of the images. And also how warp and weft works in the tapestry is very similar on how the digital imaging is working. And yeah, I think
so
this is,
you fed images of 3,000 tigers into this. You created a data set, and then you fed that into the algorithm, and then it produced this sort of abstracted image of a tiger that just kind of somewhat resembles the stripes of the animal, so to speak. Just something of that animal. You need a lot more images, millions of images, I would say, to resemble an actual tiger. So thereby you're creating this sort of new, as I mentioned earlier, like a digital species or a digital fauna. Have you thought about trying this again with the updated number of tigers? Luckily, we have more tigers in the world now, and the new forms of technology. Have you tried like updating the experiment?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, because now technology is more and more grown, and also tigers. So it could be interesting to do this experiment again. But I think that in a way is also significant. It's important that I did it in that year, and it gone like that, because to me it's a visualization of something that was happening in that period. So
Right.
it's like a, I don't know how to say, the image is disappearing also itself, like the animal.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
it's a
and
visualization in this sense.
yeah, and it speaks very much to that, to that time, 2020. And again, that idea of environmental loss that I think Dixon had brought up earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the production? I think I read somewhere that these were produced in India. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. I choose to produce these tapestries in India because is the country in which there are more living and free tigers in the world. So I also like to make a connection in this sense. So I contact some people working with tapestries in India, and we talk a lot remotely, actually, because it was 2020. And I follow all the productions of the tapestries, and I choose materials. These are wool and silk, so they send me some example of materials, and then I choose it and I design the final drawing for the tapestry.
I think one of the things that Ginny and I love so much about your work was the fact that this is a tapestry, because you know, the work is very much based and steeped and dependent on the algorithm and these technological tools, but the medium that you've chosen to depict the outcome of the project is so accessible, I think, to everybody. You know, this idea of tapestries or fiber art is something that it's also a historical medium and genre. Does that kind of go into your thinking as you're creating works, is that the outcome should be something that the public can sort of understand easily? Or is it sort of dependent on each project?
Yeah, I like in this case that I wanted something that you can also touch, something soft like an animal. So
Although
that's
I'm
why,
sorry, we will not let people touch the artwork.
of course.
But yes, I appreciate the sentiment behind it.
Ideally.
There is this tactile quality
Yeah,
to the artwork.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, also it was surprising actually to me discover that something very ancient like tapestry is so connected to something very technological like a generative algorithm, because I was very surprised discovering how they works really similar. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but yeah, in the construction of the image, in the construction of the texture of the tapestry is it's actually the same by points, by ropes, by
Arcs
pixels.
and the webs, yeah.
Yeah.
The movement is similar with the
Also, the
algorithm.
movement is very similar in the construction by crossing lines.
Which is fascinating. I think I read a quote. You said in an interview that what interests me about less usual technological tools is that they can really help us to dissuade our human attitude. Can you explain what you meant by that? Like elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I really like to think that technology can help us to see in a different way. And because every device is built for a different reason. So every device brings a specific meaning and a specific reasons. And so what I like is to think that if we are able to see in a different way, maybe we are also able to think in a different way. And this is what why is so important using different technologies to me, because it can help me to see different things and also think in a different way from what I'm used to.
And I think that that's a nice, again, dovetail to Amanda's work, who does force us to think in through the gray, in a sense, help us or force us to think through some like challenging questions, and not receive this idea of technology or environment or various issues in a passive way, but a more sort of active way. So Amanda Phingbodhipakkiya is based in New York, so represents our New York committee. And her practice spans sculpture, large-scale murals, installation, and public art campaigns as a way to amplify marginalized voices. With a background in design and neuroscience, Amanda's works have also highlighted women in STEM fields. This work in New Worlds, titled The Primitive Sign of Wanting, is an interactive work in which visitors are confronted with questions that challenge them to consider how technology can both serve and subjugate human beings through near future scenarios. So, Amanda, will you help us all understand this work a little bit better and how people will be able to interact with it?
Absolutely. I think it probably makes sense to share a little bit about my practice broadly so that we can sort of contextualize this work within it. So I look at my practice as channeling loss and description into portals of renewal and repair. And I think of my work as these liminal spaces and living monuments that invite audiences to reclaim and rebuild and restore through participation, as Ori mentioned, and communion. So my sculptures are often drawing from really disparate and juxtaposed parts. As you can see in this image, it looks like, you know, you're walking through a post-apocalyptic world and you kind of happened upon it on the sidewalk. And I'm often melding cultural identities and colonial legacies with bodily and psychic impacts and really harnessing the power of kind of mundane objects to tell larger evocative stories that mirror our lived human experiences. So much of my work of late as a response to the world has been focused on fostering care and belonging, and folks have described it as sort of like feeling hugged by the work. My work in New Worlds is a little different. It won't make you feel like you're being hugged for sure. It may make you feel unease, perhaps unsettled, and hopefully curious. But it does come from this place of care for humanity. And I'm always calling back to this quote by James Baldwin: if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. So this installation is essentially a love letter to humanity. It's a declaration of hope when we feel very worried and uncertain about the future, and it's an archive of resilience and really a call to sort of moral vigilance when we need it. And you know, as Oren mentioned, this piece asks us to consider, you know, what is justifiable, for example, in the face of climate catastrophe. You know, should we alter wildlife or even our children to enhance their capacities? You know, if we're parsing the question, you know, who will technology serve and who will it subjugate? If we don't know, it's probably subjugating us in some way. And of course, these are all questions that don't have easy answers. And in the same way, the interaction, the participation in this piece isn't very straightforward. So you will actually be invited to scan a QR code, and you'll speak with this ancient future oracle exclusively through the device that you bring with you. So once you sort of like enter the world of the primitive sign of wanting, you'll be invited to make some choices. You'll get to choose, you know, what you would like to tackle. It could be mental health. It could be rising healthcare costs. It could be, you know, the increase of urbanization. Many, many different journeys that you can go down. And, you know, it's an exercise to kind of, we're exercising our moral imagination together, essentially. So you'll be in dialogue, and you know, there are so many complexities of actions and consequences. And I always call back to Hayao Miyazaki's work in his films. And I love his films because there are no perfect villains. There are simply self-interested people or complicated people whose actions perhaps harm others, but also help others at the same time. And you know, I named this piece The Primitive Sign of Wanting because I was reading some of Elizabeth Anscombe's work. She is a philosopher, was based out of Stanford, and her work interrogates how our, ethics need to be kind of, our responsibility is to not only our intentions, but our outcomes as well. And we need to consider both when we make decisions. So, her thinking and her work is very newly urgent. And I thought that I might take y'all through sort of like a potential kind of journey, just as a peek into what you might explore. So this one is about the mental health crisis. So the mental health crisis has escalated globally, with rising rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders affecting millions. It's a real problem. So traditional interventions struggle to keep pace with the demand for support and necessitating innovative solutions. Okay, so that's sort of like the opening. To combat widespread mental health issues, scientists are proposing using CRISPR, which is a gene editing mechanism to modify crops, to infuse them with serotonin precursors, to essentially sort of like ease your mental health burdens. So this scientific initiative aims to naturally increase serotonin levels in consumers, and this enhances your mood. It really combats depression through diet. Seems great, right? By incorporating these genetically modified foods into the global food supply, this project's aims are to provide a preventative measure against mental health disorders on a very global scale. So you have a choice, do you launch this initiative? Let's say that you do. Okay, so we have some bad news. This plan, though extremely well-intended, ended up spiraling into another health crisis. So people, being people and drawn to the promise of just happiness through diet, ended up really overindulging in these modified foods, which threw off their body's natural serotonin balance and led to an alarming spike in mood-related disorders. I also think about, for example, in contemporary times, Ozempic. So the dietary shift had these kind of dire consequences and dramatically increased cases of diabetes and strokes, and just really messed with people's metabolic health. And this just very well-intended attempt to engineer a dietary solution to mental health not only unfortunately failed, but also unleashed all these new waves of health challenges. And this just underscores the perilous side of meddling with nature's dietary blueprint. So now you have a choice again. Do we want to devise a solution, or do we just want to kind of like exit altogether? Let's say that, we're going to once again use technology to devise a solution. So now scientists are thinking, rather than modifying the foods that we eat, researchers propose going to the source. So now we're going to use CRISPR to genetically modify embryos to eliminate the predisposition to depression and anxiety. This seems like a very interesting and potentially effective preventative approach that aims to engineer resilience into future generations. Sounds pretty good. And it can significantly reduce the prevalence of these conditions, which is, what we're all aiming for. So then you again have a choice. Do you modify the embryos? And now let's say that we modify the embryos. So here's what happened. The advent of designer babies genetically tailored to avoid mental health issues gave rise to a new form of inequality, genetic privilege. Now, this divide saw those with access to genetic modifications enjoying all these inherent advantages, including enhanced mental resilience, while the majority of folks unable to afford such a very helpful intervention face continued susceptibility to depression and anxiety. So this disparity not only deepened societal rifts, but also sparked a profound ethical dilemma, challenging the essence of human diversity and fairness. So this quest for mental well-being essentially morphed into a catalyst for unprecedented social and moral conflict. And then, you know, the piece itself doesn't actually give you any answers on sort of how we solve all of this, but it does invite you to think, and it does invite you to explore these different pathways. And, you know, the scenarios that I've written, they're obviously drawn from research, but they're fiction, currently, at least to our knowledge. And I think this work really invites us all to deepen our understanding of these biological and technological advances and their profound impact on our society going forward.
That's incredible. I didn't know, like I knew how you would start out the piece from various conversations, but I didn't know the kinds of constant sort of quandaries that we would be facing. I can find myself getting very frustrated as especially, you know, wanting some kind of resolution at the end, and obviously not
Right.
having one, as there isn't a solution to all of these issues. Now, you've shown a previous iteration of this work in which you
That's
present
right.
these sort of dilemmas a number of years ago. They were forced to pick sides, and then it sort of carried them through this journey. Were the questions that you asked similar? Were they different? Have they evolved to the time that you are now? And have your considerations of the kinds of questions you want to pose, are they different? And what was the general finding amongst the public then? That was in Las Vegas in the year
2019.
2019.
2019. Yeah.
2019. So it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago, but of course, technology has, you know, exponentially sort of progressed since 2019. So of course, the subject matter needed to evolve, and you know, we've made real advances, which are both exciting but also concerning at the same time. I think in my original iteration of the work, it was important to see how audience members interacted with it, and the amount of sort of discussion that was had felt, I think, a little bit shallow, because I was asking folks to make decisions based on very limited information, and I felt that in this evolved evolution of the work, I wanted to bring folks into a world in which they could have deeper journeys and really understand that even with the best of intentions, we can still create disorder, and we can still create crises for ourselves if we aren't careful, and even if we are.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of questions pop up. So I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to, let's see. Okay, somebody asked for an example and you gave one. Grace, please let me know if you see a question that I'm not seeing.
There are a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay, I'm looking at that right now. So this is to everyone. Have this work and your work with technology changed your understanding of authenticity and authentic natural experience? This is from Phil Katz. So Amanda, since you're the last to speak, maybe we start with you. Has your work changed your ideas or perceptions of authenticity and what's authentic?
You know, I think because my work is rooted deeply in what is human and rooted deeply in community, I think the ways in my work I'm trying to bring humanity out really actually just grounds me more deeply in authenticity, because I think working with technology underscores for me how being deeply human is messy and complicated, and how there aren't easy answers. And the process of working with technology, which is iterative and also messy and complicated. And, you know, sometimes if you're working with technology from, for example, different generations, they don't work the same. And it's very similar and kind of a mirror to when we do intergenerational work as well.
Yeah, what about what do you think, Dixon?
Oh man. I think when I think about when I first came into working with media and technology, especially building these, I was looking at really old technologies that I could bring up to the present moment historically through microcontrollers or data. And I had this real belief at first that I could literally measure the world in other ways with this tech in a very like naive way. And it was gonna, you know, present something that people were gonna be able to interact with their own bodies and activate and you know, in a way. But the more data I collected and the further I got into the programming of things, the building of things, building structures, the more that I actually found out that there's so much nuance. And so I think as Amanda was saying, there's these you know, there's so much complexity when you're working with communities of people, especially when there's interaction in the work. There's so many other factors coming into the work. And then I began thinking again about my background in painting and thinking, well, why would we make, you know, work in a way, thinking about these subconscious or felt desires and thinking about visualization as like a way to talk about things we can't directly visualize and using tech in that way. So I guess to answer the question, it's created, I think that we can always try to work in a way that supports our values and that is aiming for objectivity, authenticity, thinking about critique as something that shows the wants and needs in a project and that requires feedback and reiteration. But, you know, we're always kind of blinded by what we don't see sometimes. So,
Yeah.
I think it's good to be critical and good to continually be aware.
And your work is so much about looking between the natural and the artificial in a sense. You know, how, as the question goes, how has your work, this particular work, but your practice in general, impacted your understanding of authenticity? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I think also that it's very complicated to define what is authenticity. And I think that in our lives, technology always change somehow our perception. So yeah, I think that it's also something mediated in a way. There's something between, I don't know, what it actually is something and what we perceive about it.
You're muted.
I did the same thing. Just a few minutes ago, there's a really interesting question that I want to ask everyone, which is that all the panelists, how can your research and practice encourage, you know, the young girls and women that you teach, whether formally or informally, to consider educational and career opportunities that bring together arts and humanities with STEM rather than seeing them separately as separate pursuits? So bringing sciences together with arts and humanities. Amanda, let's because so much of your discussion has to do with that. Let's start with you again.
That sounds good. Thank you for this question. I think it's a difficult one to answer because it's one that we struggle with in a society that loves to silo us. It loves to ask us to choose, you know, will we be scientists or mathematicians or doctors, or will we be artists? And I think it misses the grounding for, you know, science and technology in general, and that, you know, we are trying to find a pathway forward as humans, you know, as sort of like a collective people. How do we improve the lives of citizens everywhere? And I think sort of like putting work in the public sphere that deals with the melding of fields, that deals with kind of humanity's core issues, but looks at it through a lens of technology, or, you know, invites people to participate through technology, I think is a way where it can coalesce in the minds of young people that these aren't so separate after all. And we are all kind of asking the same questions, but perhaps with different processes, methods, and outputs.
Yeah.
Yeah, the overlaps between them rather than seeing them so distinct distinct from one another. Dixon, what about you?
Oh man, I love this question. I saw in one of the chats that someone said STEM should be STEAM, and I adding art in. And I actually joke with my department at Mount Holyoke. I run the media arts program here. So, I always have people coming in who think we have these like preconceptions of what artists do, and there's sort of pop cultural references that, we go to studio. I came from, traditional arts as well. And, I think that with every project, when I introduce students into the class, let's say, I expect them to have zero knowledge of anything. And, I think a big thing with technology for me is in my own journey was I graduate from art school I hadn't taken math since high school, and because of the open source movement at the time, because of, a lot of the resources that were available online helped me find community in these other conversations. And through those communities I was able to develop projects, so I think if someone's and the projects allowed me to learn, different programming languages, or, how to use like a CNC machine, or how to do all this. And, by actually working with our hands, I think that that's a really important knowledge gathering tool. It's a form of thinking. And I think that we've devalued it quite a bit in our education system and our culture. And if I find that the students that I get making things based on an idea, and then thinking, what are the tools that come in producing that lead backwards? I was playing Sherlock Holmes with them. They're having to use math and science and learn programming and learn these like intermedia techniques to get their metaphors and their ideas across. And if we look at it that way, I agree with Amanda, it's not separate, it's all integrated. And, even looking forward at the ways that college level education is currently happening, there's so much more integration between the humanities and the sciences. I'm very hopeful in the next few years it continues to visual thinking and design thinking, as we have emerging generative or other types of tech. What is a substitute for thought?
Yeah, and thinking in that really interdisciplinary way. Irene, any final thoughts? We're at 1 p.m. So the final words are yours before we sign off.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that we are used to in schools to think about these things separately, but it doesn't make any sense actually. And it would be nice to consider everything in an interdisciplinary way, of course.
I love the idea of STEM into STEAM. That's great. That could be the sort of theme that comes out of this roundtable, right? Well, thank you so much, Irene, Amanda, Dixon, for tuning in, for joining us, or engaging us in this incredible conversation. And I'm going to hand it back to Grace, who will sign us off.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you again, Dixon, Irene, Amanda. These conversations fill my cup, and I know I'm not the only one. So really, thank you for sharing your visions with us today. I also want to thank Joy for her language services as our cart captioner. Always a pleasure to work with you. I want to thank my colleagues at the National Museum of Women in the Arts who helped to organize this program, Takes a Village. I want to thank NMWA's outreach committees who partner with our museum on this ambitious exhibition. In particular, thank you to the leaders and members of the Georgia Committee, Gli Amici, the Italian Committee, and the New York Committee of NMWA for making it possible for today's featured artists to participate in New Worlds. And lastly, thank you to all the members of the museum here with us. Your support really does drive exhibitions like this one, programs like this one, and overall this machine, this mission for gender equity in the arts. So thank you. Our next and final panel in this series is going to be on April 17th, again from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. I just put a link to register in the chat, but that one is going to focus on the power of community and connection, and it discusses the ways in which artists in the show are using communal world building to play a role in their work. So I hope you'll join us again then. Okay, thank you all so much. Take care, be well, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.